In the name of God, my name is Mehdi Kortnavasi. This is the fourth movie of the chapter 2, Key Principle of Software Architecture. And in this movie, we will talk about the key design consideration. Then the first is to determine the application type. Choosing the appropriate application type is the key part of the process of designing an application. Your choice is governed by your specific requirements and infrastructural limitations. Many applications must support multiple types of clients and may make use of more than one of the basic architecture type. This guide covers the following basic application type. The first, applications designed for mobile devices. The next is the rich client applications designed to run primarily on a client PC. The third is the rich internet applications designed to be deployed from the internet, which support rich user interface and media scenarios. The next one is service applications designed to support communication between loosely coupled components. And the last is a web application designed to run primarily on the server in fully connected scenarios. In addition, it provides information and guidelines for some more specialist application types. These include the following: hosted and cloud-based applications and services. The next, Office Business Applications, or OBA, that integrate Microsoft Office and Microsoft Server technologies. The next is the SharePoint Line of Business, or LOB, applications that provide portal-style access to business information and functions. In my opinion, type of application you want to design, it strongly depends to the market or target market for the end user you want to sell the applications. Although in this era every year the technology change and the modern languages, modern platforms and hardwares come, and you just decide to design a software to easily support, implement and service to your customer. The next is determine the deployment strategy. Your application may be deployed in a variety of environments, each with its own specific set of constraints, such as a physical separation of components across different servers or a limitation on networking protocols, firewalls, and router configurations, and more. Several common deployment patterns exist, which describe the benefits and consideration for a large range of distributed and non-distributed scenarios. You must balance the requirements of the application with the appropriate patterns that the hardware can support and the constraints that the environment exerts on your deployment options. These factors will influence your architecture design.
In this unit, we're going to talk about the processes of deployment and release. Most of this live lesson deals with all different kinds of software, whether that's embedded or software as a service or user installed. But in this module, we'll be particularly dealing with web-based systems. In the case where you're going live with your service, in many ways, if we've been practicing continuous delivery correctly, which means that we've been deploying all the time throughout the process of building software to acceptance testing environments, staging environments, and so forth, release to production is just another deployment. Well, almost. There are some differences. When you're actually going into production, you have to prepare a remediation plan. What are the known risks when we're deploying to production? What are the things that could go wrong? How are we going to remediate those different things? We need to talk to support, marketing, sales. We need to give potentially training to users. And then we'll typically have go and no-go meetings and coordination meetings of all kinds. And so communication is much more important when you're going to production. If you have change advisory boards, part of the role of change advisory boards is making sure that all these different kinds of things are in place before you go into prod. And that is an important role of change advisory boards, communicating between all the different people who should be informed or involved in the process of going to production. And finally, we would hopefully rehearse that release rollback process or the roll forward process if we're using roll forward instead of rollback in order to push out emergency fixes. These are all things that you need to be aware of that are different from just pushing changes to, say, a staging environment. In this section, we're going to present one of the key patterns behind low-risk deployments to production, and that is that low-risk releases are incremental. And there's a whole series of patterns that we have making sure that low-risk releases are incremental, which we'll investigate throughout the course of this unit. The first pattern we'll look at is expand contract. When you're releasing an entire enterprise system, that will typically can be comprised of many different services. And so on this diagram, I've represented just a very simple case with the main kinds of components we see in enterprise systems. So there's some static content, which might be images or HTML, CSS files, JavaScript, some dependent services, which we rely on in order to make our application work, and of course the ubiquitous database. Typically, we want to avoid deploying the whole thing at once. And that's for a couple of reasons. Firstly, that's a lot of moving parts. And secondly, it makes it hard to roll back. One of the ideas that has come to fore recently is the idea of immutable architecture. And immutable might be the wrong metaphor because obviously you are moving data around and your systems are changing state. But nevertheless, the idea that at the API level, you're not changing existing objects or the schema of existing objects in production, I think is very important. This is sometimes called the expand contract pattern. This is what Mike Nygaard calls it in his book, Release It. And the idea here is instead of overwriting the static content, you put the new static content for the new version of the app side by side with the old version. You basically version it. You could have just different directories for every release that you're putting out, so you don't overwrite the old stuff. And so you can put the new content out before you do the release. And if you need to roll back, you don't need to change it. You just point the application to the old version, and that will work fine. We can apply a similar pattern to database changes. And the pattern here is, again, we don't touch existing objects. We add new objects side by side the old ones. To give a very simple example, we want to change our address column to be address line 1, address line 2. We don't delete the old column and add the new ones. Instead, what we do is we add the new columns to the schema side by side with the old ones. And those columns will initially be null. And again, we can add those new columns, those new objects, side by side with the old ones before we release the version of the application that depends on them. And then in the application, we add some extra code, which looks to see if those new columns are there and if they're null. If the columns aren't there, or if they're there but they're null, then it's going to read from the old column, but we're going to try and write to both columns. And in this way, the application is going to lazily migrate the data from the old column to the new column. But if we need to roll back our application, we can do an application rollback because the old address column contains the updated data. So we haven't lost any data in the course of doing that. If we then need to redeploy the new version, what we can do is we can just set the new columns to null and then have the new version of the app lazily migrate the data again. So in this way, we've decoupled the deployment of the database changes from the deployment of the application. They're independent of each other, and I can roll back and forth the app and roll back and forth the database completely independently of each other. However, this simplicity in terms of deployment, again, has a cost in terms of the application. We have to add that extra code to look and see if the columns are there and to write to both. That's the extra complexity you've incurred as a result of trading off for ease of deployment. So it's important to note that these kinds of patterns, there are trade-offs in order to implement them. But what you're doing is making it much cheaper and lower risk to do those deployments incrementally in pieces and to decouple the deployment of the application from the other things that the application depends on. You can do that long before the deployment, and crucially during normal business hours. Adding new objects that the application doesn't care about, whether it's the static content, new versions of upstream services, database changes, they can be done during normal business hours because they do not impact the deployment of the application. So reducing risk and at the same time making sure that we can do most of our deployment work during normal business hours.
And the next concern before you making decision is determine the appropriate technology. When choosing technologies for your application, the key factors to consider are the type of application you are developing and your preferred options for application deployment, topology, and architectural style. Okay, thank you for watching for this movie. And for the next movie, we will discuss about the quality attributes and the cross-cutting concerns. Thank you.